The thunder of jet engines shook the ground beneath Jang Hyok-su's feet as he stood behind the chain-link fence of the prisoner transport area, watching in stunned amazement as rows upon rows of gleaming F-86 Sabre jets stretched across the massive concrete runway like silver arrows prepared for flight. The American airbase at Suwon seemed to extend beyond the horizon. Hangars the size of factories, control towers reaching toward the clouds, fuel trucks moving in endless processions, and mechanics working with clockwork precision on aircraft that represented technological sophistication beyond anything he had ever imagined possible. It was October 1951, and Jang was being transported to a permanent prisoner of war camp when his convoy had stopped at the airbase for refueling. In those 20 minutes of waiting, he witnessed more military aircraft than existed in the entire North Korean Air Force. All maintained to standards that made them look like they had just rolled off factory assembly lines. The contrast with the handful of aging Soviet fighters and improvised airstrips he had known during his service as a ground observer near Pyongyang was so stark, it seemed like comparing candles to electric floodlights. Jang had been an aircraft mechanic before the war, one of the few North Koreans trained to service the limited number of planes that comprised his country's modest air force. He had worked on runways carved from rice fields, using hand tools to maintain Soviet-built fighters that were already obsolete when they arrived in Korea. Spare parts were scarce, fuel was rationed severely, and most airfields were little more than flattened dirt strips that turned to mud in the rain and dust storms in the wind. What he was seeing at Suwon represented aviation infrastructure on a scale that seemed to violate every assumption he had held about the limitations of military aviation. The American sergeant supervising the prisoner transport had noticed Jang's fascination with the aircraft and had begun explaining, through a Korean interpreter, some basic facts about American air operations in Korea. There were dozens of air bases throughout South Korea and Japan, he said, each capable of maintaining hundreds of aircraft in constant readiness. The planes landed and took off around the clock, supported by ground crews that numbered in the thousands and supply systems that ensured every aircraft received whatever maintenance, fuel, or ordnance it needed to remain operationally effective. This is the story of that airfield and dozens like it. Monuments to American industrial power and organizational excellence that would challenge everything these prisoners thought they knew about modern warfare, technological capability, and the relationship between homeland production and battlefield dominance in the age of aerial combat. The Korean War had begun in June 1950 with North Korean leaders confident that their limited air force, supplemented by Chinese and Soviet aircraft, would be sufficient to establish air superiority over the peninsula and neutralize American technological advantages through superior pilot training and revolutionary commitment. Within months, it became clear that American air power operated on scales and according to principles that made such calculations irrelevant. Jang's service as an aircraft mechanic had given him intimate knowledge of North Korean aviation limitations. The entire Air Force consisted of fewer than 200 aircraft, most of them aging fighters that required constant maintenance using improvised parts and techniques. Pilots flew with minimal training due to fuel shortages, and many planes remained grounded for weeks at a time, waiting for replacement parts or repairs that required cannibalizing other aircraft. The sight of hundreds of American aircraft parked in perfect formation on concrete runways designed for heavy use in all-weather conditions was overwhelming for someone who understood the technical challenges involved in aviation maintenance and operations. Each aircraft appeared to be in perfect condition, with ground crews performing systematic inspections and maintenance procedures that ensured consistent readiness and performance standards. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, who supervised one of the maintenance crews at Suwon, had volunteered to provide basic explanations of American air operations to curious prisoners during transport stops. His casual descriptions of maintenance schedules, parts inventory systems, and pilot training programs revealed organizational depth and resource abundance that seemed impossible based on North Korean experience with aviation logistics. The hangars themselves were architectural marvels that impressed prisoners with construction backgrounds. These were not temporary shelters or converted buildings, but purpose-designed facilities large enough to accommodate multiple aircraft simultaneously while providing workspace for complex maintenance procedures. The interior lighting, ventilation systems, and specialized equipment suggested that American military doctrine considered proper aircraft maintenance essential enough to justify enormous infrastructure investments. The fuel storage and distribution systems at American airbases represented logistical capabilities that boggled minds accustomed to fuel scarcity and improvised refueling procedures. Massive storage tanks held more aviation fuel than North Korea's entire monthly production, while specialized trucks and pumping equipment enabled rapid refueling of multiple aircraft simultaneously according to standardized procedures that minimized delays and ensured flight readiness. Private Kim Kol-ho, a former construction worker who had helped build improvised airstrips for North Korean forces, was particularly amazed by the quality and scale of American airfield construction. "Look at the concrete," he whispered to fellow prisoners as they observed runway maintenance procedures. "Look at the drainage systems, the electrical installations, the precision of the markings. This is not temporary military construction. This is permanent infrastructure built to support aviation operations indefinitely." The aircraft themselves represented technological sophistication that seemed to belong to a different era compared to the Soviet-built fighters that equipped North Korean air units. The F-86 Sabre jets were sleek, modern, and obviously designed according to aerodynamic principles that prioritize performance over simplicity or ease of maintenance. Even to untrained eyes, these aircraft looked faster, more maneuverable, and more technologically advanced than anything in communist arsenals. The pilot facilities at American airbases provided insights into how different societies approached military aviation and the treatment of specialized personnel. American pilots had access to comfortable quarters, recreational facilities, medical care, and educational opportunities that seemed more appropriate for university students than military personnel. This investment in pilot welfare suggested that Americans viewed aviators as valuable resources requiring careful nurturing rather than expendable tools to be used and discarded. The contrast with North Korean pilot treatment was stark and revealing. Jang remembered pilots who lived in the same primitive conditions as ground crews, who received minimal training due to fuel constraints, and who were expected to achieve results through ideological commitment rather than technical expertise or adequate preparation. The systematic American investment in pilot development suggested fundamentally different approaches to human capital and military effectiveness. The radar and communications equipment visible at American airbases represented technologies that seemed almost magical to prisoners from societies where electronic systems remained primitive and unreliable. These installations enabled precise coordination of air operations, weather monitoring, and threat detection that made American air power more effective than simple aircraft numbers might suggest. As autumn progressed in 1951, Jang and other prisoners had multiple opportunities to observe American airbase operations during transport and medical procedures that required visits to facilities near major aviation installations. Each exposure reinforced their understanding of American air power as systematic rather than improvised, abundant rather than limited, and technologically sophisticated rather than dependent on individual heroism or revolutionary spirit. The maintenance procedures observable at American airbases impressed prisoners with mechanical backgrounds who could appreciate the systematic approaches to aircraft care and repair. Specialized tools, standardized procedures, detailed record-keeping, and scheduled maintenance intervals ensured that aircraft remained operationally ready rather than grounded for extended periods awaiting parts or repairs. The industrial implications of American airbase operations were staggering when prisoners began to understand the supply chains and manufacturing capabilities required to maintain such facilities. Every aircraft represented thousands of components manufactured to precise specifications, while every airbase required construction materials, electronic equipment, fuel, ordnance, and personnel support systems that exceeded the industrial capacity of entire North Korean provinces. Captain Morrison, who commanded the prisoner transport unit, had begun allowing interested prisoners to observe airbase operations from safe distances during scheduled stops, understanding that such exposure served educational purposes while demonstrating American military capabilities in ways that were more effective than formal propaganda. These observations provided practical education about American industrial and organizational superiority that influenced prisoner attitudes toward the war's likely outcome. The bombing missions that originated from American airbases had devastating impacts on North Korean infrastructure and military capabilities. But witnessing the scale and organization of American air operations helped prisoners understand why their homeland's defenses had proven so ineffective. The systematic approach to target selection, mission planning, and operational execution suggested military doctrine based on technological superiority and resource abundance rather than improvisation and individual initiative. Winter weather in late 1951 and early 1952 provided opportunities to observe American airbase operations under challenging conditions that would have grounded most air forces entirely. Specialized equipment for runway clearing, aircraft winterization, and cold weather maintenance enabled continued operations despite snow, ice, and sub-zero temperatures that demonstrated organizational depth and technical competence. The medical facilities available at American airbases impressed prisoners who had experience with North Korean military medicine. Specialized aviation medicine, emergency response capabilities, and systematic health monitoring for pilots suggested that American military doctrine considered human factors as important as technical capabilities in maintaining aviation effectiveness. Spring 1952 brought increased air activity as American forces prepared for anticipated communist offensives and expanded their own operations throughout the peninsula. The scale of preparation was overwhelming. Aircraft maintenance that exceeded the total technical capacity of North Korean air forces, delivered with systematic efficiency that suggested unlimited ability to sustain and expand air operations as necessary. The psychological impact of witnessing overwhelming American air power was profound for prisoners who understood that their homeland possessed no comparable capabilities and no realistic prospects for developing them in the foreseeable future. The daily sight of hundreds of aircraft operating from facilities that seemed more like small cities than military installations reinforced understanding that the war's outcome was predetermined by material advantages rather than ideological commitment or tactical innovation. The pilot training programs observable at American airbases revealed systematic approaches to aviation education that contrasted sharply with North Korean methods. American pilots received extensive classroom instruction, simulator training, and graduated flight experience that prepared them for complex missions requiring technical expertise and split-second decision-making under combat conditions. As summer approached in 1952, the airbase operations had become routine parts of prisoner experience during medical visits and transport procedures, but their cumulative psychological impact was enormous. Daily evidence of American aviation superiority made North Korean air defense efforts seem hopeless, and the eventual outcome of the war seemed predetermined by technological factors rather than revolutionary determination. The armistice negotiations that intensified during 1952 were influenced by the reality that American airbases represented unlimited ability to maintain devastating air operations against North Korean and Chinese forces while protecting American ground troops and supply lines from effective enemy air attack. The visible demonstration of American air power became a form of diplomatic pressure that encouraged negotiated settlement. The civilian contractor presence at American airbases provided additional insights into American economic organization and the integration between military operations and private industry. Construction companies, technical services, and specialized maintenance providers demonstrated the mobilization of civilian resources for military purposes that characterized American war production. Private Yu Sung-ho, who had worked in North Korean aircraft manufacturing before military service, found his understanding of industrial capacity fundamentally challenged by exposure to American aviation operations. If Americans can build and maintain dozens of airbases in foreign countries, while simultaneously supporting aircraft production at home, he reflected during private conversations with fellow prisoners, what does that say about their total industrial capacity compared to our own? The final months of 1952 brought increased urgency to prisoner observations of American airbase operations as armistice negotiations suggested that the war might end in the near future. Many prisoners began paying closer attention to aviation technology and maintenance procedures, hoping to gain knowledge that might somehow be applicable to reconstruction efforts in their homeland. The winter of 1952 to 1953 provided final opportunities for prisoners to witness American aviation excellence as airbase operations continued efficiently despite severe weather conditions that would have completely disrupted North Korean air operations. The contrast between American technological competence and their memories of North Korean aviation limitations was emotionally powerful and intellectually humbling. Spring 1953 brought the final phase of airbase observations as armistice negotiations moved toward conclusion and prisoners prepared for eventual repatriation. The prospect of returning to a homeland where such aviation capabilities were impossible created complex emotions about leaving behind daily evidence of American technological superiority and industrial capacity. The final major air operations before the armistice in July 1953 were emotionally significant as prisoners understood they were witnessing their last demonstrations of American air power that had provided daily lessons about the technological foundations of military effectiveness and national power in modern warfare. The repatriation process that began in August 1953 included air transport that was itself a demonstration of American aviation capabilities as thousands of prisoners were moved efficiently and safely through systematic procedures that utilized the same organizational excellence that had maintained combat air operations throughout the war. Jang Hyok-su stood at the window of a transport aircraft during his repatriation in September 1953, looking down at the American airbases that dotted the Korean landscape like monuments to industrial civilization. The runways and hangars represented something that had fundamentally changed his understanding of modern warfare and national power. The recognition that technological superiority and industrial capacity were more decisive than revolutionary ideology or individual courage in determining military outcomes. The North Korea he was returning to had been devastated by American air attacks that had destroyed most aviation infrastructure and eliminated any possibility of rebuilding competitive air power for decades to come. The overwhelming demonstration of American aviation superiority he had witnessed throughout his captivity would remain impossible to match in his homeland, making the memory of those massive airbases even more significant and lasting. But Jang carried with him more than just memories of American aircraft and aviation technology. He carried a fundamentally different understanding of what modern nations could achieve through systematic investment in technology, infrastructure, and human capital that prioritized effectiveness over ideology and practical results over revolutionary rhetoric. The story doesn't end with repatriation and return to a homeland where such aviation capabilities remained impossible. In the decades that followed the Korean War, some former prisoners carried their observations of American air power as they contributed to reconstruction efforts and gradual economic development. While comparable aviation remained unavailable, the understanding of what systematic technological development could achieve influenced perspectives on industrial priorities and infrastructure investment. Some former prisoners became advocates for improved technical education and industrial development within the constraints of North Korean political and economic structures, arguing that attention to technological excellence could improve both military capabilities and civilian welfare without undermining revolutionary objectives. Others shared their aviation observations with trusted colleagues as examples of what advanced industrial societies could achieve through systematic investment and organizational excellence. The American personnel who had operated the massive airbases returned to civilian life with enhanced appreciation for the technological infrastructure and industrial capabilities they had always taken for granted, along with deeper understanding of how such capabilities appeared to enemies who lacked comparable technological and organizational resources. The airbase system had demonstrated something profound about the relationship between technological capability and military power in modern warfare. It had shown that nations with advanced industrial capacity and systematic organization could project devastating power globally while maintaining domestic prosperity, and that such advantages could be more decisive than tactical innovations or ideological commitment in determining military outcomes. But perhaps most importantly, the massive airbases had revealed the power of technological superiority and systematic organization to communicate national strength more effectively than any propaganda or diplomatic pressure. The prisoners who had witnessed American aviation operations had experienced something that transcended political ideology and military doctrine. The recognition that modern warfare was fundamentally a technological activity that required industrial capacity, organizational excellence, and systematic investment on scales that only the most advanced societies could achieve. The aircraft had completed their missions and returned to base, but their demonstration of American technological power and aviation excellence would prove more lasting than any political system and more influential than any ideology seeking to deny the importance of technological development and systematic organization in determining the capabilities and ultimate success of modern nations. Today, advanced aviation capabilities are recognized as fundamental requirements for military effectiveness and national security throughout the developed world. The North Korean prisoners who first witnessed American airbase operations in the 1950s had observed an early demonstration of the technological capabilities that would eventually transform global military doctrine and strategic thinking. The runways had been cleared for the final time. The aircraft had been mothballed or transferred to other duties, but their demonstration of American technological and industrial superiority would prove more enduring than any political settlement and more influential than any treaty in shaping understanding of what modern nations could achieve through systematic investment in technology and human capital. That perhaps is the ultimate lesson of the Korean War air bases, that sometimes the most convincing demonstrations of national power come not through dramatic aerial displays or political ceremonies, but through the quiet efficiency of perfectly maintained runways supporting endless streams of advanced aircraft operated by highly trained personnel using equipment that represents the best achievements of industrial civilization. The planes had returned to their hangars, but their message would echo through history. That true strength in the modern world lies not in revolutionary rhetoric or ideological commitment, but in the systematic ability to develop, produce, and deploy technological capabilities that can dominate any battlefield and protect any national interest.